republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
All right, we are returning. Thank you for joining with us this morning. We appreciate your visiting with us. You're listening to America's Voice Now. We're in our second segment this morning, and I'm going to give you a little bit of an update on a couple of issues, not the least of which is where things are moving with America's Voice Now directly, in the sense that we are going to begin working with our new video studio this week, and we'll be able to hopefully by the tail end of this weekend have some new video that will be posted up that will be more along the lines of a show that will be related towards television. In other words, we've built a brand new radio studio or video studio, and we'll be able to utilize that to create a commentary program that will really have an opportunity to share with you some valid information and vital information in reference to where things are headed with the nation. So we'll be able to present that information to you later on this week. We are going to essentially, it will be more similar to a commentary show where I'll be able to bring on guests that can discuss different topics with us, and we'll have them in a visible, viewable format. So it will look more like a news program than a radio program. And I'm encouraging you to participate with us as we move forward. Our goal is to educate America as to what is happening around us every single day, and to help us understand and express our displeasure with that. We do have a right to redress our grievances with our government, and the truth of the matter is that the mainstream media is not accomplishing their journalistic role and function any longer. And so we want to make sure that we're working to resolve that, and at least give our listeners and our friends and our family an opportunity to hear the truth. Okay, the federal government shutdown is in play. It's been ongoing now for a number of days. For the record, by the way, even though that we are in what would be considered shutdown, actually 83% of the government is still operating. But the problem here is that what we have is a government that is working diligently to increase the pain for average Americans. There is an Amber Alert website that's been shut down to notify people about Amber Alerts locally in their area. Now, these are the types of, if you're not familiar with Amber Alerts, what they are is when something occurs that, a child's been kidnapped, or there's some kind of a criminal act going on, it gives them an opportunity to put out this Amber Alert, which is sent to your cell phone, your television, your radio, etc., so that the public can participate and say, yeah, I saw that car with that license plate driving down the interstate, and there was a little girl in the back seat. So they've shut this Amber Alert website down. And they've shut down many, many others, including the FCC's website. The problem is that they've kept open websites like Michelle's Let's Move program. And I got to tell you, this is a willful, intentional attempt to injure the nation. Our fourth segment this morning, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a program, or about an article which I wrote over the weekend that I posted up on our website, and you can find it there. But the simple truth is this, folks. We are in a position where both sides of this fence are saying, we're not going to negotiate back and forth on this. The shutdown is in play, and they're now going to wrap and, if you will, merge the issue of Obamacare and the government the brand new debt limit increase that has to be accomplished by the 17th into a wider discussion. And the real problem here, as I see it, is that what's really occurring here is that the Treasury Department is giving, the most horrifying stories to the American people, and yet they don't have true answers. In other words, Jack Lew was on all of the talk shows over the course of the weekend. Now, Jack Lew is the Treasury Secretary, And he states that on October 17th, we'll be out of money and there will be only $30 billion in cash on hand. We'll no longer be able to borrow money because the debt limit has been reached and we can no longer borrow cash to continue to spend. The problem with that, ladies and gentlemen, is that what he's not telling us, and it is a lie by omission, because the truth is we have been $25 million under the debt limit since May. Yes, since May. When we are $25 million under the debt limit, and Lou has willfully been manipulating the books to keep us at that artificial rate for all of this period in time, I've got to ask you the obvious question. Well, where has the money been coming from? And if we've been for all intents and purposes, in out of money and out of borrowing power since May, where is all of that money? The real question here is not a function of whether or not we should extend the borrowing limit. The real issue here is, where are we going and how do we slow the growth, if you will, or the massive borrowing that we already have? Everyone, including the government itself, when you talk to the Office of Management and Budget, they say that Obamacare alone is enough to bankrupt us. Well, we already have $17.7 trillion in debt, and that's the debt that is immediately expendable on an annual on a basis where this is just to keep the government operating. It doesn't take into account that $17.7 trillion doesn't take into account the other areas of debt where we talk about the unfunded liabilities that are long-term liability. In other words, if we take the debt clock, right? Have you ever been to usdebtclock.org? The debtclock.org shows us what the actual true real debt is, because what the press and quite frankly the administration is not telling you is how much real debt there is out there. And I got to tell you, it's pretty frightening. When we talk about unfunded liabilities, we have well over $126 trillion in unfunded liabilities, in addition to the $17.7 trillion that we already owe. That is a $1.1 million liability per taxpayer. Wow. So take $126 trillion, add $17.7 trillion to it, and then add in whatever the administration wants to ask for. And here's another problem with this. The administration is not saying how much they want to borrow. Now, never before in history has a president come out and said, expand the borrowing capability, but I'm not going to tell you how much I want. He's trying to force Congress to do it. And he's trying to force Congress to come up with a number because he does not want to be personally responsible for that number. That is a terrifying concept. Here is a president who, for whatever reason, blame rolls off this guy's back like a water off of a duck's back. We're talking about a current debt per citizen right now of $53,000, actually more than that. It's $53,550. But we'll give the administration the benefit of the doubt. The current debt right now is actually in excess of $53,000 per person alive in the United States. If you calculate it per taxpayer, it's $150,000. Now, what that tells you, by the way, is that only 1/3 of the nation is paying taxes. In other words, if the debt is $50,000 per citizen, it's $150,000 for taxpayers. That means that only 1 in 3 are paying taxes. We cannot have a nation that operates where only 1 in 3 people is paying into the carrying charges. It just doesn't, fiscally, it doesn't work that way. We have 144 million people in the U.S. workforce and 144 million in the U.S. taxpayer base, right? The problem is that we also have 90 million who could be paying taxes but aren't because they're unemployed. Those who are actually in the labor force but not functionally working is 90 million people, ladies and gentlemen. 90 million Americans are not working. That's the other third that could be cooperating and participating in the expenses of the nation. I mean, the goal, of course, would be that you had, out of the 315 million people in the United States, 200 million of them working, right? The rest are, children or elderly who are retired and what have you. The official unemployment number is 11.2 million. But the true number of those who are not in the labor force functionally in any way, shape, or form, this includes everything from the unemployed to the unwilling to be employed, to those who have completely given up, who have just said, clearly there's just nothing I can do to resolve my own personal problem here, and I'm going to go on to disability, I'm going to go on to food stamps, I'm going, et cetera, et cetera. That's 90 million people, folks. That's almost a third of the nation who is not in the labor force, but is capable of being in the labor force. Okay? So when you look at these kinds of numbers, these are actually frightening because the nation cannot subsist with only 1/3 of the country participating financially. I mean, you can't have 1/3 of the nation paying the debts for 2/3 of the nation, and those 2/3 demanding more and more and more and more and more. It doesn't work that way. We can't do that. The total national assets of the United States of America, in other words, when they look at assets, they say, what are the assets of the nation, right? In other words, what are we worth? What's our net worth? It would be like you doing the exercise of saying, well, okay, I own a house, I own a car, I own a 401k, I have some money in the bank, I've got some stocks, I've got some bonds, I've got some jewelry, and then taking all of that and figuring out the total gross value of that, and then saying, okay, now let's subtract my liabilities from that. The mortgage I owe on the house, the car, the balance on whatever payment I owe left on the car, any other notes that are, or any other liabilities that go against that total level of assets. And your net asset base or your net worth is what's left. If you have a gross asset value of $100,000, let's say, and you owe $90,000 in liabilities, including mortgages and car payments and taxes and what have you, you have a net worth of $10,000. It's that simple. We have a total national asset of $104 billion, $104 trillion. $104 trillion. We currently owe, just on unfunded liabilities, $126 trillion. We're already bankrupt. In other words, you cannot sit here and say, if we sold everything that we owned, small business assets, corporate assets, household assets, everything that we own would not cover our debt. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the definition of insolvency. If a company owes more than the assets of that company, it is insolvent. If you have more in payments than you make, you are insolvent. There is no other way to look at it. And they want to borrow more. That's the problem. Instead of getting this amount of money under control, instead of spending amazing amounts of money on every crazy cockamamie scheme that comes up, they're spending the money that they're borrowing to fund every nutty project that comes down the pike. And yet they refuse to do things that will actually assist the country, like the XL pipeline as an example. But meanwhile, they're giving out grants left and right. Look, did you know that the company in Canada, who was the primary vendor for Obamacare, for the development of the Obamacare system, by the way, it's in Canada, not in the United States, got a contract or a series of contracts from the federal government, handling not just Obamacare, but a bunch of other things, for $1.1 billion. You heard me right. $1.1 billion. That's $1.1 billion, folks, that has left the United States of America and gone to a foreign nation, to a foreign company in a foreign nation for the deployment and the creation of the Obamacare website and a host of other issues. And by the way, it's not limited to Obamacare. They do Department of Defense contracts and stuff for them. They do stuff for all these different federal agencies, housing and urban development and whatever, EPA. $1.1 billion. You see, and there are some of you that are listening that are saying, well, what the heck is a $1.1 billion? That's the rounding error on the Senate's lunch bill. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the problem. We have forgotten how much $1 billion really is. We can no longer allow this government, this nation, to continue to borrow in a format that allows for no actual accountability for where the money is spent. I mean, if your son or your daughter, your teenager came home and said every day to you, hey, Mom, I need $1,000. You'd say, well, what are you spending all this money on? I mean, we're not made of money. Go out and get a job for yourself. You would say to that child, I need an accounting for why you are spending this much money. There is no accounting, folks. There is no accountability. And now they want to add Obamacare to that liability, and it will become another unfunded liability. And in addition to that, because of the way that all of these government programs are written, like Social Security, like Medicare, like Medicaid, like the Prescription Drug Liability Project, all of these become mandatory spending. In other words, it's not subject to being cut or trimmed. You cannot trim or cut that spending which is declared to be outside of the shucks, I just forgot the word. This is mandatory spending. In other words, it's not subject to being trimmed or cut back in any way, shape, or form. It must be allowed to be spent, irrespective of what else happens. Social Security is one example of that. Prescription drug liability, that was the second one. And by the way, that's up to $21 billion, folks. We're $21 billion in the hole on the prescription drug liability issue. On Medicare, we're $87 trillion in the hole. In Social Security, we're $16 trillion behind. I mean, these numbers are not, I'm not making them up. Go to usdebtclock.org and go look them up for yourself. I know it'll take you a few minutes, but if you hover your mouse over any one of these entries, it explains what they are. The total national assets we have is $105 trillion, but we currently owe, just on unfunded liabilities, not counting the national debt, $126 trillion. So our liabilities exceed our assets. That's the simple truth. And no matter how else you cut it, what we are now looking at is the United States of America, for all intents and purposes, is insolvent. There's no other way to characterize it. We owe more than we're worth. And they want to increase that. And they're holding out, saying they're going to default on the debt if we don't fund Obamacare. Now, look, the nation and Congress, this concept of I'm not going to negotiate with anybody is completely unacceptable on the part of the president and on the part of the Senate. The whole goal and the job of Congress, they have a fiduciary responsibility to oversee and watchdog the spending of the nation. And for Obama to sit there and say, and Harry Reid, for that matter, to sit there and say, we're not going to negotiate, it's an all or nothing deal, take it or go hang, is unacceptable to the it's inexcusable. Because the job of Congress is to monitor and watch the spending of all these agencies, all these government programs. Somebody has to be a watchdog. And if you take that job away from the House, where the Constitution says all spending must be started at the House, then you have effectively eviscerated the constitutional obligation and the duty and the right of the House to review and monitor and hold the executive accountable for their actions. It's that simple, people. Look, we cannot borrow another we can't borrow another $1 or $2 trillion and not have the same problem that we would have if we went into default. The world markets are looking at us now and saying, these guys are insolvent. The truth is, we are already to the point where foreign nations don't want our debt. That's why the Federal Reserve is buying our debt back directly. Almost every amount of debt that we incur on an annualized basis is now being bought by the Federal Reserve. Not by China, not by Japan, not by the European nations. Nobody's buying our debt but the Federal Reserve. And their current balance sheet is $3.46 trillion. In the last 4 years, folks, it's grown by $3 trillion. If you take that $3 trillion and you add that to the $17.7 trillion we've already got, we're already $21 trillion in debt. I mean, these numbers are so far beyond amazing to me. I almost have to wonder, are they putting something in the water to keep America from recognizing how far down the rabbit hole we've fallen? I mean, it's really, truly stunning to me that people are sitting there saying, these guys have to get their act together and continue. We don't want to continue. Somebody's got to put a halt to this. Somebody now. All right, we're going to take a break. When we return, we will pick up on our next topic, which is the amount of data that's going into the Obamacare system by anyone who can actually get through. Nobody's getting through on the federal side, by the way. But on the state side, there are 14 states that have their own exchanges, and one of them is Kentucky. And they've put a warning out that anything and everything that you put into that system is subject to being transmitted, monitored, and shifted around and disseminated by the federal government at their option to anyone they so choose. And you're signing a waiver allowing them to do that by just using the system. We're going to talk about that in a minute because that's some dangerous info. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Find us on the web at americasvoicenow.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/America's Voice Now and youtube.com/America's Voice Now. We'll be right back.